Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Vintage Books Live. Tonight, we're very excited to have Andrew Durkin, who is a writer from just across the river in Portland. Andrew's latest book is Bibi Blundermuss and the Tree Across the Cosmos. And I forgot to ask you, Andrew, if you have a copy there with you. Do you happen to have a
I
copy of
do.
it?
I do. Yeah, should I grab it?
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
can
That
grab it.
way I can show everybody. Mine's out in the office, so I wasn't able to bring it tonight.
I don't
Yay,
know if
thank you. Yes. And we have one in store now. So you're more than welcome to order. Um run, don't walk. No, I'm just kidding. But I always start off with this because I think it always starts off the conversation really in an interesting way is can you tell us the story of how this book came to be?
um I can. How much time do you
The
uh,
sort of medium-ish version.
I mean it's I guess it's tangentially related to my experience in publishing in general, which I hadn't really I sort of fell into publishing by accident almost with my first book, which was a nonfiction book for adults about music, and which only got published because I happened to be. It started actually as my dissertation, and I started putting pieces of it online on my blog in the early like 2006, 2007, somewhere around there. And an agent found it, and she convinced me that she could sell it, and she did. And I never like sought out like a career in publishing, even though I always considered myself a writer. I just didn't like. I didn't know enough about kind of what was possible to have an author career. And I was also kind of really focused on music at that time. Um, and anyway, so I got that book published and sort of got the bug. And in the period where I knew the book was out of my hands and yet it wasn't out in the world yet, I was like extremely anxious. Like it was a very uh, stressful time for me because it was my first book and I didn't know kind of how people were going to respond to it. And I knew that since it was a book about music and I was making a living as a musician, it was, it would have an impact, I felt, on my music career as well, regardless of what I did with publishing. And so I literally turned to writing fiction for kids as what I thought was a distraction. I thought it was just like, what is the most like what's the opposite end of the spectrum from writing a very like uh intense, dense, philosophical, heady book about music aesthetics. Like what could I write that would be fun? That would be like lighter, that would be more of a kind of a lark. And so I kind of turned to it as a distraction, and that got me through that period. But then also showed me how little I knew about writing for kids, and how much more complicated it was than I thought it would be. And that sort of just dovetailed with feelings that I had had when I was much younger, when I was interested in like um, adventure stories, and like when I was really young, I did do a lot of writing of like fiction stories that would be for kids. And there was a period I went through like wanting to write screenplays and getting involved in film, and I was like really big in Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark and that whole like adventure, um, and sci-fi fantasy kind of like conglomeration of films that came out when I was in middle school. Um, and so like I had that kind of background, and so like it kind of felt natural to kind of move back into telling stories and telling like exciting stories and adventure stories. Um, and so it just kind of snowballed from there. I think that I it's one of those things, like a lot of things that have happened in my life, I feel like I didn't necessarily like plan for, but I have been open to like the happy accident when it comes up, and then I've been ready to kind of pivot when when
Yeah.
an opportunity becomes available. And I love that kind of challenge, and that sort of experience really kind of piques my interest. And so as I got like to know more about the kid lit world, or the world of writing fiction for kids, I it just kind of like stuck with me, and it's been something that, just because of other things that have happened along the way, um, being a parent myself, becoming involved in publishing in other ways, becoming an editor, working with a lot of other writers, meeting folks like you. I mean, people in critique groups, and through various fiction writing groups. It's felt like a good direction for me. So that's
Yeah.
why I
Yeah.
kind of stuck with it.
So, sort of the main, not the main adventure story in BB, but a lot of the main sort of under theme in BB is her dealing with fear and anxiety. And um, I wonder if you could share a little bit about why that was important to you, and how you came to choose BB's particular fear, her phobia that she has, what led to you choosing that particular thing for her to be dealing with?
Yeah. So Bibi, for those who haven't read the book, is afraid of trees, and she has something called hylophobia. Um, and I the thing about having a phobia is that um, often, like, you can be fully aware of how ridiculous it might seem to other people who don't have that phobia. It might seem like really, um, so for example, when I was a kid, my phobia was of, I was very afraid of like, it wasn't quite like a germophobia, but it was like definitely fear of like accidental like poisoning, or
Yeah.
like somehow like ingesting something that would kill me. Like I was literally afraid of like, I went through a period where I was literally afraid of like being in a science class, because I was afraid someone would spill a chemical and somehow like it would be, by accident I would consume it, and it would kill me. Like that was something that I went was a very intense fear for me for a long time. And I think at the time I understood like it wasn't rational. Like, like there was no way that teachers would put kids in a science class if they expected that like some percentage of the kids were going to get killed by the experiments they were doing. That's just doesn't make sense. And I understood that. Um, but I couldn't do anything about it. Like I had no, like whatever it was that kind of set that phobia in motion wasn't something that I felt I could control. And so with BB, I felt like I wanted to choose something that someone who didn't have that particular fear, would simultaneously like recognize as being, um, extreme and unusual, and perhaps odd. But I wanted to write it in such a way that it felt real. Like it still felt like,
Mhm.
you recognize that it was overwhelming for her, and it was something that she didn't like. She had to process how to kind of get a handle on that.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that's kind of why I of course, like, I mean, the universe around BB kind of revolves around trees. Like that's the
Yeah.
central like magical element. And so of course, that's another piece of it, is like to make her afraid of this thing that is, since she is like fated to express the magic of this world. to make her afraid of that seemed like a good opportunities for some tension, because ultimately she has to go directly toward the thing that scares her.
Yeah, yeah. So I know the answer to this a little bit, but can you talk about just the process of evolution that the story went through and how you came to sort of shape it the way it is, you know, change characters or focuses or and why you ultimately ended up where you did. um you know, I for those who don't know, I happened to be in a critique group with Andrew several years ago when and he was working on sort of middle drafts, because you had already, I think, gone through at least one or two drafts before I saw it. But it, you know, the story changed pretty substantively um since between the first time I read it and what it ended up to being. And I'm just curious, like, from sort of the back room, you know, for people who read the story as it comes out in a book form, but maybe don't see what goes on behind the scenes. Like, how did you make the decisions? Why did you decide to change from where you some of the things that you were doing in earlier drafts? And
Well, one of the characteristics of the earlier drafts was that they were all much more, the energy was much more dispersed. And I was doing something that I think a lot of authors seek out, like on an initial draft, um, uh, especially with fiction, especially with kids fiction, which was I wanted to have like 6 or 7 different protagonists. I wanted to have all these different points of view. I wanted to write from different points of view. I wanted like each chapter to be told from a different character's perspective. And I was ambitious with it. And it's not that there's anything, I mean, I think that's great when you can pull that off. But as a first novel, I didn't have the tools necessary to make that work. And I had a really great agent who was just very like honest with me and just basically said, this is going in too many directions, and I'm not feeling anything for all these characters because you're taking them, you're taking me in all these different directions at once. And so, I had to make a decision. Well, where's the focus really? And I think recognizing that it was supposed to be Bibi that was the key, because, and in an odd way, I think, maybe I was struggling with the same problem that she as a character was struggling with, was I wasn't going toward the thing I needed to go toward. I was afraid, of embracing that character because of maybe what that would tell me about myself, what I would have to kind of own in my own, in my own past, in my own childhood. Um, and so once I made that decision, and once I realized that Bibi was the main character, that's when things like started to coalesce. And I felt like, and I think that was right around the time that I started working with you guys, because uh, there was also a period during which like it was kind of divided between Eek, which is
yeah,
Bibi's cat,
yeah,
and Bibi. Like it was kind of going back and forth between the. In fact, I think there was one whole draft where it was. I had narrowed it down to the two of
yeah,
them, but I still hadn't made that choice.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
who is the
yeah,
I really want people. Um,
yeah,
so I think that it's a hard thing to do, because it's a good example of the kind of thing, where you have to kind of let go of stuff that you may be in love with, that
yeah,
may be
yeah,
interesting to you, but isn't necessarily serving the story.
yeah, Well, and I think the amusing thing is, as a critiquer, is that you had to let go of things that the critique group even liked, like characters that we really liked. And it wasn't that you were wrong about it needing to focus on Bibi, but there are a few characters that I'm like, okay, but I'm writing this down, and you have to write a book about this character later. So, but I think that that is an interesting jump between where a lot of writers stop and they don't keep going to that next thing that's going to make their work so much stronger, is that they can't get past the point of, yes, you literally might have to like axe a whole character or a whole storyline or whatever, that isn't bad. It's just that it's taking away from the main story. And as a reader, it was interesting to watch you go through the process, because I was kind of like, well, but that isn't bad, I really like it. And it wasn't bad, and it was good, and but it was diluting the central storyline. And so I think you made the right choice, but it was an interesting thing to watch, because it helped me learn even more that, yeah, sometimes what you're cutting, you aren't cutting because it's bad writing. You're cutting it for different reasons. And yeah, it was interesting. So what do
It's
you
funny
hope?
how
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it's funny how like now that all of this time has kind of elapsed since going through that experience, like when I go back and think about those earlier drafts, that from this like in retrospect, it's so obvious. Like it's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I don't even know how I could not have. I don't know why it would have been such a struggle to me at the time, because from this side of it, it feels like, yeah, of course, that's obvious.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's a good example of the value that having a keen reader who is outside of
yeah,
your work,
yeah,
what they can bring to an
yeah,
analysis of where your draft is at.
yeah. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, that you had started these stories as sort of a way to distract yourself while waiting for through the publishing process for another book. But I'm curious, more specifically, what drew you to middle grade specifically, as opposed to maybe picture books or maybe young adult, and what made middle grade appealing?
I mean, part of it was my own child was sort of entering middle grade at the time that this was kind of in initial stages, and that I that I sort of envisioned having kind of a captive audience that sort of as
Yeah.
this was,
Yeah.
and also just like I was kind of attuned to the kind of the context of what it was like to you know be middle age in middle grade at this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but I think on some level it felt like a place from which I could um, I mean, part of it was like it felt like the right length book for me to say what I wanted to say about the character. Like I didn't feel like I would have any kind of pressure to deal with, like um you know um the kind of like interpersonal stuff that comes
Yeah.
up with
Yeah.
like YA books, like
Right.
romantic relationships or
Yeah.
whatever, like
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
sort of complications. Like it's here's somebody who is on the cusp of like entering adulthood and they're dealing with big issues, but but it's still somehow kind of like pure in a way.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
like there aren't other distractions.
Yeah.
And it almost felt like an opportunity to be a little bit more like philosophical in a weird way.
Yeah.
um,
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
I I have so much admiration for people who can write picture books well, because to me, like, that is even more pure in some
Yeah.
ways. Like, you
Yeah.
really have, you've got it's like writing a sonnet, like
Yeah.
you've got real limitations on kind of how you can express what you want to express. And so, like, I never considered myself in that.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that. And that's like, that requires a higher level of writing as far as I'm concerned. But middle grade, like, it had all the stuff I wanted. Like, it would allow me to have an adventure. It would allow me to, like, be, like, imaginative. I think it would allow me to be imaginative. I felt like freed, um,
Hmm.
in terms of, like, how creative I could get with the story. Um, uh, because I don't know, it just felt like, uh, like, maybe with adult fantasy, like, there are more expectations about
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
fantasy should, sort of include, like, what the tropes are a little bit more solidified in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and uh and I like, I'm really, oh, like, some of my favorite fiction books have always been, like, sort of the classic middle grade-ish type stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of, like, write in that vein. um so I think that's kind of, it's not that I don't, now that BB is out, and I am thinking sort of more broadly in terms of, like, what this could evolve into as a series. I'm not like, I do want to try, like, other, um, audience levels. I would like to write an adult, fantasy book. I would like to write an OYA fantasy book, but this piece of it felt like it felt like it should
Yeah.
be middle grade.
Yeah. So you mentioned at the beginning that you started this project as a way to distract yourself from a very different project, which was, music, aesthetics, theory, and that kind of thing, and also nonfiction, which is a different animal in a lot of ways. But I'm curious. I mean, I can think of all the myriad of ways where that's really different. Those are two really different areas. But I'm curious to know, like, what do you think is similar about writing a nonfiction book versus a fiction book? Like, are there similarities? Are there things that you take from one to bring to the other, or vice versa, that maybe people wouldn't expect that would be similar?
um I would say, uh I mean, one thing I learned writing my nonfiction book, and the people who, didn't like it, I think, wouldn't recognize this, but they didn't read the original version. What I definitely learned in revising the original version, so in taking it from being a dissertation to making it a trade
Yeah.
nonfiction book, was how to say something with fewer words, and the
Yeah.
value of that. um, because being schooled in an academic context and writing for, like, a
Hmm.
dissertation, like,
Yeah.
you have one idea of, like, you know uh, what is, rigorous, like, how to make an argument. um, and it's usually like, throw more words at it. and
Yeah.
uh,
Just make the
and I
sentences longer, it'll be great.
um, and I really came to appreciate the value of, and it's something that's been reinforced in my career as an editor, but I came to appreciate the value of how to say something with less words. Like, that is always my top line concern with any of the writing I do. um, Even in an email, like, I
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
aggravating. Like, I spend so much time just, like, trying to make sure it's as clear as it can
Yeah.
possibly be.
Yeah.
um, and I guess the other thing is just that, the things I really struggled with my nonfiction book, and the reason I was having so much agita about it, was because there were a lot of, like, um, issues in kind of digital music at that time that were impacting myself and other musicians that I knew. Like that was kind of around the time that, Spotify was coming out, and,
Yeah.
musicians were kind of realizing how digital music was going to really sort of change their economic viability.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to like make an argument that like recognized how exciting it was to be able to hear any song you want. As someone who loves music, an amazing thing that I like would have loved to have had when I was in high school. As someone who's like a you know ravenously in love with music, that was a benefit. But there's a flip side to it. And so as I was writing that book, what I was struggling with was how best to kind of like recognize the positive and the negative in that equation. Um, and so to me, like that was a challenge of empathy, basically. Like how do you like try to see something from someone else's point of view and express it in a way that shows like some heart and some
Yeah.
concern. And I think that's the central challenge of fiction, really. Like
Yeah.
writing fiction well really has so much to do with like um, trying to understand how is this character feeling in this moment. Like
Mhm.
not like you're not there to kind of impose stuff on them. You're there to kind of like have the reader feel like they're in this person's head. They're experiencing
Yeah.
what the person is experiencing. So oddly, I do think like having written that book on music gave me some insight into that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to jump to, so you've got a couple of other roles in your life, and one that you've mentioned is editing. And for those of you who aren't aware, Andrew is the owner of Yellowbike Press, which is a author services company. And what is meant by that is people who, usually it's by and large people who are self-publishing, but sometimes it's people getting manuscripts ready to submit to in traditional publishing, maybe need editing services, layout services, copy editing services, and so those are the kind of things that an author services company provides. And I'm curious, you also fell into that world as well, and how does that continue to inform your own work, as you're working to help other people make their writing better? How does that then circle back around and impact your writing?
Um, I mean, the editing piece of it is has had certain practical impacts on me, in the sense that like you just learn to, after you edit your first 100 books, like you start to pick up like there are patterns. There are things
Yeah.
that like most writers do, and you start to develop this kind of this set of things to look out for, and it basically it's made my writing faster. I mean, I still struggle, but there's a lot that I've internalized, just because I've read so many books that are in the process of being edited. Um, I think also probably on some level, I mean, you know, it's taught me that most authors go through the same dark night of the soul, basically.
Yeah.
Like most authors have that struggle where they're either, you know, very self-conscious, they're comparing themselves to other people, they're not sure they made the right choice in kind of investing the time and work that they have already, in their project. There's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of second guessing. Um, and then there's a lot of like the overcompensating, like there can be like the veering to the other side where you want to protect whatever kind of um fear you're feeling
Mhm.
by insisting that the way you've done it is fine and doesn't really need
Yeah.
to be changed.
Yeah.
um, so there are all these kind of like mental states that kind of go with authorship that I think most authors share, and in different ways, but I think there's a certain commonality there, um, and that, that puts me often in the role of being just someone who's willing to listen, which is fine. I'm happy to do that. I like being in that role, but it's also kind of like, it's been helpful to me when I have those moments, and it's helped me kind of recognize those moments in my own writing, and recognize that, just because I've hit a wall today doesn't mean like I'm
Yeah.
at the end of the process. It's just like this is a momentary thing, and the main thing is to just keep going.
Yeah. Well, that was what I was going to ask is, do you find that a lot of times it's just a matter of slogging through things that you're not able to circumnavigate, that with every piece you have to go through some of these processes, regardless of how many times you've done it, and you just have to keep on going because eventually it'll get better. I know I struggle with that because I think the illusion that I sometimes have is this will somehow get easier, and I will, my first drafts will someday I'm going to write a first draft that's just so brilliant that I don't have to do anything else to it. Of course, that's never going to be the case, and that you just realize that no, it's, this part's going to be this way and this part's going to be this way, and if I'm, not going to get to the end until I just keep going. So
Yeah, yeah, and it does help just being. I mean, this is why, like, this is one of the main benefits of going to conferences, or being in a critique group, or joining organizations, or just writing with a buddy at the coffee shop. Like having other people around you who are going through the same thing helps you recognize that this is part of the process for everybody, and it gives you there's strength, I think, through that
yeah,
commiseration.
yeah,
And so I think that's a really valuable thing to have, and then to, just to help somebody get to the point where, they've gone through that second guessing period, and then they've published and they've gotten some good responses. They have, maybe it's not like selling like hotcakes, but they've gotten some
mm,
good, feedback from people that they trust, and they have a book in the world, and that's
yeah,
like that
yeah,
in and of itself is an amazing thing.
yeah.
um so
So the one more thing, the one other piece of your sort of constellation of things that you've done is the being a musician. And I'm curious if music informs your writing at all in ways that you are conscious of, or maybe in ways that you recognize later but you weren't conscious of at the time, or
I'm sure it does. I don't it is less conscious for me
yeah,
now. I mean,
yeah.
I like literally think, I don't really think in the same terms, um when I'm, because I still do write music, but it feels like a different, it's actually an easier energy for me to write
Yeah,
music than it is
yeah.
to write prose. I'm sure on some level, like I'm very attuned to, um, perhaps like to a fault, I'm attuned to the sound of words, and
Mhm.
like almost like more. I always like want to write poetically in addition to writing like with some concision and writing something exciting. Like I don't want to
Yeah,
just like say he went down the street. I want to say it in a way that is going to feel like it has some kind of like art to it. um and a lot of that is wrapped up in the sound. And that has actually been a it's been a problem in the past, because I think, there's definitely been times when, like, I've gotten in trouble because I'm privileging the sound over the meaning of a word.
Yeah, yeah,
And that can cause confusion, sometimes, I think. I've noticed that in kind of responses from beta readers and things. So I've gotten better with that, but I still, it does matter to me, like, how the words sound. It does matter to me kind of how, like, what the pacing is, what the rhythm
mhm.
uh, uh, of the sentences are. Um, so yeah, I think I'm sure it has an impact.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
not.
not conscious
I
necessarily.
used to, like, when I was like when I was kind of more interested in film, like when I was back in high school, I remember I would, like, I did write screenplays, and I would put music on as I was writing it, like a
Yeah,
scene, because
yeah,
that would, like, help narrate basically what the action was supposed to be. But
yeah,
I
yeah.
actually can't write with music on now. I find it distracting.
Yeah, I can't
Um,
either.
so
I can sometimes edit with it on, but I can't do it in the initial writing. So what is next? You mentioned that there might be sequels coming at some point. Do you have a timeline in mind, or are you just working towards the next book at this point?
yeah, I mean, I made a decision. So when I actually wrote BB initially, I didn't, even though I had kind of like general ideas about, like, what the kind of broader world could be and what kind of longer story could be, I wasn't kind of committed to that one way or the other. I didn't really know what I was going to do.
Yeah,
Uh, but so that was like, initially BB was out on submission for an attempt to try and get it published traditionally. But when that didn't work out and I decided to self-publish, I made a decision that I do want it to be a series, because that's really kind of the only way to get any traction. I felt,
yeah, yeah,
in self-publishing, or maybe not the only way, but it's a really good way.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so yeah, so I've just been, I since so it's BB came out actually this month a year ago, so it's been a
yeah,
year that has been.
yeah,
And in that whole period, I've been, pretty much every day I've been working on, like, the next books in that series. There's a short story, and then there's a book two, and then there's a much bigger book three.
okay.
Um, so those are the pieces that I'm kind of working on right now.
Very cool. Lindy, if you have any questions at this point, we're gonna wrap up. I just have one more question I'm gonna ask Andrew, but it's kind of a filler question, so you have a chance to think of any questions if you have any. So you're welcome to turn your mic back on if you want, or you can type questions. Either way is just fine. But you don't have to have any if you don't. It's okay. It's not required. Um, so I was gonna ask, I was try to ask at the end if you have any books that you have read recently that you really enjoyed that you would recommend.
Oh my gosh.
I know that's like a hard question. Maybe just one or two. You don't have to name all of them.
I mean, yeah, that's just another question that would take a while. I mean, I should say, like, my reading is very scattered, like, so I
Yeah,
spend most of my day reading the authors that I'm working with.
yeah,
I'm spending a good amount of time reading quote unquote successful, self-published authors, because I'm trying to get a sense for, like, what's working in that
yeah,
world.
yeah.
So Mark Dawson is one author I've been reading a bit of. He writes thrillers. He's a UK based author. I think he's really good. Um, uh, uh, I Karen Inglis, who's another UK author. She does she does kidlit, actually. She has a book called The Magic Lake, which was a middle grade novel that I think it was probably about 10 years ago she published it. So kind of like at that very beginning of like when self-publishing was becoming a
Yeah,
viable.
yeah. What was her name again?
Karen Inglis, Inglis. Um, and I think her best known book is The Magic Lake, but she's got a bunch, and she has some picture books. And um, beyond that, like with in terms of traditional publishing, I'd say like the book I liked most last year was She Who Became the Sun. Are you familiar with that?
Mm,
The
yeah, I haven't read it
Shelley
yet, but it's on my list.
Yeah, it's amazing.
There's so many books on my list. Uh,
A Memory Called Empire.
I've heard of
Arcady
it.
Mark.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, that, I mean, just in terms of like what I was saying before about like complex points of view, like that book
yeah,
deals with
yeah.
who have consciousness from deceased characters kind of implanted in their heads. So they have like basically voices in their heads of other people.
Oh, wow.
And so to kind of distinguish between that like kind of ghost voice and the character's kind of own voice in their head. And then there's, of course, the interaction they have with
Yeah,
people outside.
yeah.
Really
Yeah,
cool.
it always amazes me when authors can pull those sort of multiple complexities off in a way that doesn't just confuse you so much that you can't follow it. And then that's when
Yeah.
I get very, then I'm like, oh man, I'm really jealous, but also they're amazing.
Yeah, I think she did it with just like creative use of brackets and
Yeah,
italics, uh, and it was kind of like first it felt like a little bit of a bump, but like once I realized what was happening, it was very
yeah,
natural.
yeah,
Um, I'm rereading a lot of like classic stuff that I remember liking in the past and just kind of wanted to kind of reacquaint, like just kind of refamiliarize myself with. Um, Octavia Butler. I'm rereading Pride and Prejudice, like stuff that like
yeah, yeah,
because I'm very interested in the question of like, would these authors like get a book deal today?
yeah, yeah. No, that is always an interesting question to me because there's some that you think, yeah, maybe if they got an editor first. But
I
maybe
mean,
not unless they got an editor first. So yeah.
and what a shame. I mean, like, like Octavia Butler, just like as a writer, like she breaks a lot of the rules that like you would be taught in a
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of basic, uh, creative writing MFA or something. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
yet the stuff, it's so engaging and so
Yeah.
interesting. It's like a fiction of ideas.
Yeah.
Um, and I think one of the things that excites me about self-publishing is that it may, because it's outside of like the kind of expectations of the traditional publishing world.
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity for more books like that. Um, so anyway, that's a whole other
Yeah.
discussion, but that's
No, yeah. We might have to have part two at some point. But so thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And for those of you watching later on YouTube, thank you for watching on YouTube. We appreciate it. As a reminder, you can get Andrew's book, Bibi Blundermuss and the Tree Across the Cosmos, at the store or online, whichever you prefer. And thank you, Andrew, so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was good to see
Have a
you.
good night.
Thanks.